Hi everyone.
Hello.
Just going to wait for people to trickle in. Hi everyone. I think we're just waiting on our panel chair and then we'll get started. Hopefully he will join us shortly. We hope. just going to give it a couple more minutes. I'll actually just run through something really quick that's just been dropped in the chat. So just before we get started, the Q&A function, so anybody who's watching right now, if you do have any questions for any of our panelists throughout the talk, you can drop them through there. Any technical difficulties, just drop them in the chat. And then the questions will be answered at the end. Any other issues, please email at marginstocenterug@gmail.com. And finally, anybody who's watching and are currently tweeting about the conference, please use the hashtag UGHistConf so we can see your responses. We're just going to give it one more minute and then I think we'll make a start.
Yeah, on that, I think we should just make a start now. If Dr. Sarkar does manage to join us at some point, he can give his kind of introduction of the papers after you guys have all said something. I am really sorry about this, obviously. So Binal, can I hand it over to you to start the panel?
Pardon?
Can I hand it over to you, Binal, to start the panel?
Yes, of course you can. So hello everyone, welcome to the Women's World session. My name is Binal, I'm going to be moderating the panel today. I've just gone through some of the technical parts. So we're going to be starting with Mira Trivedi's paper. And Mira Trivedi is going to be looking at what is a woman, domesticity, nationalism, and reform in female print culture. So I'm going to hand it over to you.
Yeah, let me just share my screen. Hopefully that's working. Yes, okay, perfect, thank you. So what is a woman? Domesticity, nationalism, and reform in female print culture. An excessive focus on the hostile relationship between imperialism and nationalism has created a tendency to write about Indian history as a contest between these ideologies, leading to the neglect of both time periods and histories peripheral to this contest. This paper looks at Gujarati and female print culture in Gujarat. Gujarat, which was then part of the Bombay Presidency and now a state in Western India, and particularly its women, are hardly situated in the histories of social reform and domesticity, debates which occupied much of 19th century India's social and ideological history. In the context of Gujarat, native social reformers were inspired to use Victorian-based ideals of domesticity to improve their standing by showing the capacity for self-improvement. As reform became inward-facing, domesticity, and more specifically the home, rose to the surface as centers of nationalist and reformist debates. This in itself provided women with new opportunities and spaces to negotiate their own authority and identity. This is a map of 18th and 19th century Gujarat, and it's a little state on kind of in the west of India. The privilege to define womanhood in elite Gujarat fell to a group of mainly Parsi men who collaborated to create Stri Bodh, a women's magazine established in 1858 to promote female education. Despite being one of the earliest magazines aimed directly at women, Stri Bodh has received very little scholarly attention, highlighting how these histories have often sat at the margins. Stri Bodh, typical of its time and genre, was a contradictory magazine. It sought to empower women, but simultaneously was highly dismissive of what they knew or what they were capable of understanding. Take, for example, a series which ran across 1860. The aim was to teach women basic science lessons through experiments that they could follow along at home. The lessons were structured as a story. In the story, a doctor came to teach the group of women. There are conversations, there are diagrams, you can see some, and instructions on how to follow these experiments along at home. However, the doctor was very critical and condescending. With great disdain, he asked them, and I quote, "to be quiet so I can teach you." And in response to their astonishment, he said, "I am showing you this, otherwise you naive women would think that it is some kind of magic." And there was a lot of emphasis on this magazine on how women were naive and would easily fall for superstition or other lies. In the same vein, the advice to ignore elder aunties' opinions and suggestions which were rooted in superstition, can on the one hand seem encouraging. On the other hand, when that advice is supplemented by men telling women how they can be better wives or better mothers, we realize that much of what the magazine does is it attempts to reinforce a system in which men have control not just of the public face of the family, but in the domestic sphere too. Although typically the domestic sphere would be seen as the women's domain, when reform became centered in the home, men could no longer shy away from entering both the metaphorical and the physical women's quarters. For instance, in a fictional conversation between a husband and a wife, the husband provides a list of things he expects his wife to do, and you can see some on the slides. The conversation, however, is not struck up by the husband. Instead, it is the wife who has spent the entire day wondering how she can change herself so that her husband likes her more. Fictional or not, this conversation was likely a reflection of many occurring in homes across India. And the message here is clear. The burden of being likable falls on the wife, and it's she who is expected to change her behavior. In many respects, therefore, it's understandable why the sometimes patronizing tone of magazines like this might at first look as though it marginalizes women and stifles their voices. However, we can also learn that there were opportunities for women to find a voice and agency in less obvious ways. And this, to me, is what is far more interesting about the magazine as a historical archive. In an article entitled "What to Teach Today's Women," the author emphatically stated that God has made men and women in the same way. So why should women not do what men do? They have the right to. Enveloped amongst the advice on how to be a good wife and a good mother and the patronizing language were these nuggets of empowerment. The new style of patriarchy, in which husbands encouraged their wives to wear socks in public, or to learn to read and write, or to abandon parda, which was the traditional practice of female seclusion, gave women distinctive gains. When answering her self-posed question, what did women learn when men gave them advice, Judith Walsh argues that women learnt to read. Now, this seems obvious, but in the context of 19th century Gujarat, with low literacy rates, reading was not a popular form of entertainment for women. Speaking at the Golden Jubilee celebrations for the magazine, an early reader, Mrs. Wadia, commended the magazine's role in igniting her interest in reading, praising the clever choice of topics and the use of colloquial Gujarati. In fact, to maintain its status as a respectable magazine, editors were also keen to ensure topics were not excessively radical, which explains why the magazine almost flip-flopped between restrictive rhetoric and empowerment. On the slides are images of Sharda Mehta and her sister Vidya Gauri Nilkant. These were the first female Gujarati graduates who both contributed to Stree Board in the 20th century. The turn of the century saw many female writers not only contribute to the magazine but serve as its editors, thus giving women the opportunity to share their own stories and life experiences. Stree Board promoted female education in every edition, not just through long articles, but through poems and short stories which could be read to other women who couldn't read and to families who had not yet seen the importance of female education. In the poems, women were told that being educated is of far more importance than being just beautiful. Being able to hold a conversation with your husband and his English friends was just as important as knowing how to cook, and knowing basic first aid was part and parcel of being a good mother. Utilizing traditional rhetoric situated within familiar settings such as group devotional singing, the magazine continued to build upon traditional female sociability patterns whilst introducing messages of social reform. Many of these conversations in Stree Board would occur in places like the market or the village square, typical areas in which groups of women would normally gather. Periodicals of this period contributed to the development of a sisterhood through which women explored their own identities. Importantly, it provided a space for informal networks of friendship and more formal gatherings, such as organized women's congregations, to develop. Mrs. Wadia fondly reminisced about the role of the magazine in creating such spaces. Choosing public locations instead of the women's quarters also reflected the editor's choice to encourage women to gather in spaces outside of their home. Women's networks could be built up both organically and informally through traditions, rituals, and activities, which served as a forum for female interaction. Ultimately, Stree Board's confused identity highlights how defining what a woman is in 19th century Gujarat was a complicated task. despite what the magazine would have us believe at some points, a woman is more than just a mother or a wife, nor is she just an agency-less tool to be shaped by the men in her life. She has multiple identities, the power to make choices, and in the context of late 19th century Gujarat, her decision to read, to interpret, and to choose to what extent she wishes to follow the models of domesticity offered to her are undoubtedly choices worth celebrating. Thank you.
Thank you, Mira. That was really, really interesting. So I'm now going to hand over to Emma Cardole, who is going to be talking about Beyond Militarized Masculinity, exploring the role of women in guerrilla warfare. So thank you, Emma.
Yes, I will just get my PowerPoint up. Guerrilla warfare has been seen through a masculine lens in popular history and media throughout the 20th century, a narrative driven by discussions of the new man that Che Guevara promoted, as well as through the idea of academics like Cynthia Enloe, who saw warfare as an extension of violent masculinity that would exploit women within these movements. While masculinity has played an important role in resistance movements, and violence is certainly widespread too, this violent masculinity delegates the position of women to one of victimhood, with women being forced into warfare rather than seeking it out. While gender divisions in guerrilla organizations showed a level of inequality that corroborated Enloe's belief, their presence in these movements is undeniable and therefore worth studying to understand guerrilla warfare and the people who were part of it. If warfare and gender are as linked as Enloe claims, the study of the role of women in guerrilla warfare can lead to these women being seen through a new, more complex lens. It is true that women are soft. It is also true they can be the most bloodthirsty and cruel creatures. I want to be neither. It is enough to do my job. This quote by Ye Panlilio, used in her memoir about her time in the Philippines with the pro-American guerrillas in the Second World War, can be used as a framework to look at the treatment of women in the press who joined the resistance movement, as well as narratives that were echoed in the organizations themselves. Media often enjoy painting a picture of the women who joined these rebellions as lost and confused, following men into warfare without fully understanding what they were doing. They were soft and therefore more suited for working in the kitchen than they would be for active combat, and could be forgiven more easily than male fighters once they were captured, since they weren't classified as real guerrillas by the media. At the same time, women who joined guerrilla organizations were seen as somewhat defected, having lost their instincts to nurture and raise a family, moving to ramshackle encampments and living in a way that does not allow for traditional family structure. Women who left their children with a family member, like Ye Panlilio did, were seen as bad mothers who had the wrong priorities. But women who took their children to live with the guerrillas were equally criticized, since the children would be in danger and the living conditions were often harsh. They were cruel, even while they were victims at the same time, according to the media. I will be using this quote to explain the depiction of guerrilla women in media, especially through pictures, to explain the different facets of female guerrillas. Several images describing the Hug Rebellion, a communist movement during and after World War II in the Philippines, are used in Vina Lanzona's work, which he retrieved from the archives of the Philippine Free Press, as well as the Rizal Library, which shows that the images were used by the press. This is an image of Commander Li Weiwei, who was a high-ranking commander in the Hug Rebellion, and she was fascinating to the press when she was captured, who frequently referred to her past when she would participate in beauty competitions, and her feminine appearance, never being seen without freshly manicured nails and her hair and makeup done. She herself described this habit, as told by Vina Lanzona, as her preparing herself for when she died in battle, joking that at least she'd look good in death. There are several mentions of her as the Joan of Arc of the Philippines, and people were fascinated by her story, which led her to become a media sensation and allowed her special privileges in prison. And this softness in appearance that the press enjoyed clashes with her determination in battle, being a high-ranking commander who was familiar and comfortable with the gory details of direct combat and who joined the rebellion after her father was killed and mutilated by Japanese soldiers, with revenge being seen by the general public as a masculine motivation. She also seemed remorseless and said that had she not been ill at the time of her capture, she would have been fighting with the Huks until the end. Using Commander Li Weiwei, we can see how the softness was both emphasized and was fascinating to the press. The cruelty of these women was often linked to their reported treatment of their children, which to the general public showed that they were extremely different from civilians, since they lacked the maternal instincts innate to a woman. The children either taken from Huk soldiers by force, or the children abandoned by their parents in the hope they would not be involved in active combat, were used by the media as a prop to show the inhumanity of these groups, often showing children who were dirty and hungry, and then showing them in military orphanages, dressed and smiling. They also often linked this to the communist ideals of the group, which was believed to go against the traditional family structure. In this image, the president's daughter visits these children, which links the saving of these children to the political establishment as well as to the military. It is important to note that all the women, or all the people surrounding the children, are women who conform to the gender roles their society has placed them in, being in a position of care. It was also used as a tool to convince guerrilla women to return to normal society. This was meant to exacerbate the guilt they may have already felt for their actions. Using these children was an effective way to turn public favor against people like Commander Li Weiwei, since the population could forgive a pretty woman with the love for her country, but they couldn't forgive a neglectful mother. If cruelty in combat that the women committed could be explained away by the fact that they didn't know what they were doing, their lack of maternal care was seen to be unnatural and therefore unforgivable. Another manner of depicting female guerrillas, which Panlilio doesn't touch on in this specific quote, is the masculine woman idea, which I believe is also important to cover. This supports the idea that these women were so like men in their combat, bravery, manners, and sometimes even dress, they resembled a man. Several high-ranking Filipino Huks were seen as masculine in their manner, knowing combat in a way that rivaled that of other men. This shows that militarism was seen as purely masculine, and that the only way people who identified as women would be accepted would be through having masculine mannerisms. The image shown here is of Leonora Hibas, and it quickly became an image popularized for Huk women. She is dressed in male uniform and she is casually holding a gun. Leonora's story was highly publicized specifically since she turned herself in to have a chance to marry her husband, which the press used as another example to perpetuate the unnaturalness of the life of a guerrilla. They described that all that Leonora wanted was a wedding, and when she realized this, she turned her back on her radical ideas. The concept that every woman was trapped in this masculine manner, simply waiting for a chance to return to traditional family life, served the press well, but it infantilizes the hard choices that these women made and reduces Hibas's accomplishments to her decision to marry, and removes her from the dead shot that she was also known to be. While masculine depiction gets away from the victim narrative surrounding these women, it still perpetuates this idea that they were only part of warfare, since there was something masculine about them. This contrasts the soft image spoken of earlier, but it still places women in a role where warfare is simply happening to them, changing them into non-masculine and non-feminine creatures rather than the three-dimensional people they were. However, outside of the stage photographs of their children and the photos taken by the press after capture, the most common photography of female guerrillas around the world is perhaps the most striking as well. These women here are pictured are Vietnamese communist guerrillas who were simply doing their job because they believed in it. It is true that some women were in fact forced into these revolutions and some did want to escape, as the story previously told proves. But using this narrative for all the women in these movements is simply inaccurate. While exploitation was rampant in some movements, some women simply suffered through harsh conditions because they believed in the political ideals of the organizations they were part of. The pictures of the smiling women carrying weaponry is common, and these images seem disconcerting at times, but they also show that these women were in fact part of the movements, not just on the sidelines, but as active participants. It is easier to accept Eugenia's heroic character alone than to accept that she was a normal human being who laughs, makes jokes, and falls in love. It is odd to see her in full command of weapons and then fully displaying, through baby talk, her emotional vulnerability. While Panlilio's quote shows the perception of the female guerrillas as it is from the outside, it fails to represent the personal experience of the women in guerrilla organizations. The idea of the Joan of Arc, or the bride, or a participant in a movement larger than themselves that they don't fully understand, fails to show the women behind these monikers. Commander Eugenia, as described here, was part of a Salvadorian communist movement, but it also shows that she extended beyond her political beliefs. When studying women's history, it is perhaps easier to place someone in a role as heroic, or soft, or cruel. That makes it even more important to keep studying these cases. While women were part of guerrilla movements, what made them successful and what ultimately makes them valuable to those organizations, as well as historical figures worth studying, is that they were complex, unique, and could not be defined by a simple sentence. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you. That was really, really interesting. I've just noticed that our panel chair is here. Hi there. Apologies for the technical difficulties. This is the problem with doing things on Zoom. So I am delighted to welcome our panel chair, Dr. Abhijit Sarkar. So Dr. Sarkar is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Oxford. He's peer-reviewed the prestigious journal South Asian History and Culture, and has presented his findings at numerous universities, including Stanford, Columbia, and St. Andrews. His recent work has dealt with a wealth of topics related to the historical and anthropological studies in modern South Asia, such as medicine, humanitarian relief, and famine. Dr. Sarkar is currently writing a socio-cultural history of the debate surrounding birth control methods in women's magazines during the emergency rule in India. I'm sure that we can all join in and say thank you to Dr. Sarkar for agreeing to chair the panel today. And I will now hand over to you formally, where you can introduce our other two panelists. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And sorry for my delayed entry. I actually used the passcode which was sent to me like 1 week ago, and I was waiting in that chat room. So anyway, thank you very much. And I don't know, maybe without disturbing the flow of the panel, we can have all the presentations now. And then at the end, I can say something like my general observations about all the papers. What do you think?
That sounds great. It's completely up to you.
Yes, I think that would be better. Let's have all the presentations now.
Okay, so our next panelist is Edward Ashcroft, who is going to be talking about the women's experience of India's partition through fictive testimony, an alternative centre for marginalised history.
Yeah, just can you see that? Wicked. Okay. Cool. So I'd like to think about the ways in which fiction can offer new pathways in the study of India's partition. Partition was the division of the British Indian Empire into the two nation states of India and Pakistan in 1947, and you can see that on the maps here. It was characterized by extraordinary violence, mass migration, and it has profoundly shaped modern South Asia to this day. And I'm going to focus mainly on Bapsi Sidhwa's novel Ice Candy Man, which is here, and it's a partition novel published in 1988. Cool. So a traditional center of partition historiography is the high political approach. This is the classic story of how 12 men decided the fate of 12 million and was central really to work up until the 1970s. Since the 1980s, however, there's been a turn towards the human dimension of partition. This looks not just at the political causes of partition, but its effects and the effect it had on the lives of everyday individuals. So this is a case of bringing previously marginalized experiences to the center of historical study and dethroning the traditional center. So when we're looking at the margins of this history, I think it makes logical sense to use a marginalized medium. Scholars have previously done this with oral testimony and through anthropology, and since the 1990s, there's been an approach towards doing this through fiction. So I think the interesting thing here is once we start to interrogate the margins, the purpose of our knowledge changes. So traditional high political study of the center is often aimed at blaming this politician or legitimizing that nation. And the purpose of this knowledge is really to understand what caused partition. So the political division becomes the destination or the full stop of our historical study. But once we move to the margins, I think there's a whole other world of knowledge to be explored, and that full stop evaporates. So we can look at traumas and memories and the way they are passed down through generations, or we can look at the impact that partition had on family and community traditions. We can look at the way partition felt or smelt and the way that individuals made sense of it all. So when we make this move from high to low, from center to margin, when we bring the margin to the center, it allows us to do two things. First, to bring previously undocumented experiences under the microscope, which is valuable in of itself. But secondly, it also encourages us to actually develop new ways of thinking and new destinations for our knowledge and our study, which I think perhaps is in itself an even more powerful way of dethroning the center, because we're dethroning the worldview which underpins study of this center. Now, the second center I'd like to talk about is violence. Violence was slap bang in the center of partition. The atrocity of the violence was enormous and is fairly outstanding, like incomprehensible. So in terms of what actually happened in 1947, violence was very much at the center of events. But unsurprisingly, it's been marginalized in state-sponsored narratives of partition. Now, most obviously, this is because state-sponsored histories have an incentive to play down the violence out of which they were born and focus on the freedom of independence. But I'd like to suggest the fact that violence has been on the margins of historical study is not perhaps just because of the classic story of evil states manipulating their histories. Rather, as Gyanendra Pandey suggests, there is an inbuilt tension between violence and historical discourse, especially when we're talking about the experience of violence. And I think this is where I'd like to suggest that fiction can be useful. So, for example, first-hand written accounts often narrate partition violence retrospectively in the past tense and from the outside. For instance, a district liaison officer in Mian Valley reported, quote, girls of 8 to 10 years of age were raped and then put to death mercilessly. The officer's gaze here is retrospective and external to this violence. And as a historical document, I would suggest its usefulness is limited by this externality. So I think it's here that fiction becomes useful and can contribute to oral history work which seeks to engage with the victim's perspective. So for instance, in Bapsi Sidhwar's Ice Candy Man, there are scenes where violence is experienced from the victim's perspective. So fiction here is allowing us to inhabit a subject position which is outside of the historical gaze. This is especially useful in instances like the one above, where the victim is killed and the experience destroyed, or for instance, when victims suffer from serious trauma and are unable to speak about their experiences. So in the absence of any documentation, fiction becomes a useful medium to preserve and investigate experiences which would otherwise be erased. So I'd suggest these are spaces of experience which are not just marginal to historical practice because of the tyranny of the center, but also are marginal to historical practice because of the very nature of historical discourse. And so perhaps they are better served by being studied through methods like fictive readings, which in themselves operate on the margins of traditional historical discourse. Now, the main center I'd like to talk about is women. Women's experiences of partition have been multiply marginalized. For starters, women were, as Nehru suggested, the, quote, chief sufferers of partition. There was wide-scale abduction and rape and prostitution of women, as well as gruesome symbolic violence. However, these experiences have been triply marginalized. First, in society, abducted women were often stigmatized as corrupted and were forced into silence about their experiences. Second, in historiography, there was little mention of women's experiences until the feminist turn in the 1990s. And finally, in literature, at least in English language partition fiction, women's experiences of violence have received minimal attention. So in the works of Khushwant Singh or Bisham Sani, there's a notable absence of any attempt to really engage with or depict the experience of women's violations and their traumas. So it is in the context of this marginalization, I think, that Bapsi Sidhwar's Ice Candy Man becomes especially interesting. She brings the traumas of women to the center of her narrative, where they have been marginalized previously in society, history writing, and in literature. What's interesting here then is that Sidhwa very deliberately and very consciously does this. She speaks often in interviews about her awareness of and frustration with the silence surrounding women's experiences. And so it's this deliberate nature of her bringing the margin to the center, which I think points to the idea of testimony through fiction. Crucially, not all partition fiction is testimony. I'd suggest rather that fictive testimony is defined by its deliberate nature. Sidhwa is deliberately bringing this previously marginalized experience to the center of her narrative. She is deliberately voicing these silences and deliberately bringing this margin to the center. But I think this raises the question, who are we paying testimony to and what for? Ice Candy Man wasn't published in Pakistan until 2001, and it's written in English. So I think it's fair to say it would be fairly inaccessible to the often uneducated women who experienced violence, not least because this is over 50 years from 1947. So the majority of them would have passed away. Further, testimony implies a court setting, but obviously this is fiction, and it's not exactly like decades later arrests are going to be made over what Sidhwa writes. So what then is the purpose of bringing this margin to the center in Sidhwa's testimony? I'd suggest two things. Firstly, Sidhwa's writing in the 1990s after the resurgence of Hindu nationalism and the 1984 massacre of Sikhs in Delhi. So these are major instances in which partition has reared its ugly head in modern South Asian history. And I think Sidhwa's testimony is therefore a testimony both to her present as well as to the past. Secondly, I think Sidhwa's testimony is a testimony waged in memory. The beginning of the novel especially focuses on describing Lahore before 1947, and she generates this image of a kind of pre-communal, syncretic, harmonious society. And I think what she's doing here really is providing a space wherein the post-partition division of Hindu, Muslim, Indian, Pakistani is not natural or unquestionable. So this is especially useful as the victim generation dies out, as there occurs this kind of generation envelopment wherein more and more people are raised to take these divisions as common sense. And I think it's in this context that Sidhwa's bringing the margin to the center can usefully wage a war in memory. And finally, I'd like to just raise some, I think Sidhwa raises some interesting questions about the dangers of bringing the margin to the center. So this idea of voicing the silence of women's experiences of bringing this margin to the center is not straightforward in the novel. So we see this in what Sidhwa writes. So Aya, who's pictured here with Ice Candy Man, who is also pictured here, is abducted by Ice Candy Man and forced into prostitution and forcefully married. However, she is subsequently recovered, but Sidhwa engages with the complications of this recovery. And she does this through quite a nuanced way of refusing to shine a spotlight on Aya's traumas and refusing to represent them. Crucially, I'd argue what makes Sidhwa's testimony authentic is that she refuses to unquestioningly bring what was once at the margin to the center. So it's not really as straightforward here as just shining the light on the spotlight on voices that were previously marginalized. In the novel, Sidhwa refuses to ever really represent Aya's trauma, and ultimately Aya sort of just slips out the novel and her traumas are never resolved or brought to the center. So to conclude, I suggest that this is perhaps Sidhwa's clearest testimony to the traumas of partition. It is her recognition that perhaps these traumas which have existed on the margins are irredeemable and cannot be simply brought to the center without thinking about the risks that this entails. So these traumas are to a certain extent off limits to language and to representation. And I think there's a danger that in bringing them to the center, we write over them or impose meanings on them. And Sidhwa's recognition of this, I would suggest, is perhaps one of the greatest strengths of her testimony. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a really interesting presentation. Thank you. And last but not least, we're going to be hearing from Sydney Dvorak, who is going to be talking about gender colonized women in Igbo colonies before and after British rule. So I'll hand over to you.
Thanks. Share my screen. Okay. My name is Sydney Dvorak, and I'm presenting my research on Igbo women in communities before and during British rule. I would just like to begin by acknowledging that I am not Nigerian nor of Nigerian descent, and I do speak from the biased perspective of a white colonizer. I'm seeking to respectfully tell a story of agency, not oppression. So just to provide some background, Igbo land is located in southeastern Nigeria. Today, it is divided into 5 political states in which the common language of Igbo is spoken, and kinship is an important structure. Pre-colonial social organization was matricentric, and high importance was placed on the mother-daughter relationship. The Igbo language reflects the looseness of gender association in that there is no grammatical gender. Subject and object pronouns are neuter. There is no linguistic reference to a woman performing a male role or vice versa because the roles were linguistically genderless. Pre-colonially, Igbo people demonstrated organized government, lived off agriculture and trade, and practiced medicine and healing rituals. Politically, the most important part of Igbo life was the village assembly. In such meetings, all adults gathered, and any person, regardless of gender, could bring a case forward. Women in Igbo communities also held specific political gatherings for issues that uniquely concerned them. These meetings, called Mikiri, usually concerned trade, the most important activity presided over by women. In Igbo communities, men were in charge of long-distance trading, while women held power over the markets. Women made the rules concerning market and trade activity, prices, market attendance, punishments for rowdy behavior of men, and fines for those who violated the rules. If the men should refuse to abide by their rules, the women could strike. These strikes were known as sitting on a man and included women gathering at the offender's house in the night, singing scandalous songs, banging on his hut, and even damaging it. Women would keep sitting on the offender for as long as it took for him to apologize. If a man mistreated his wife or broke the trading or market rules, he would be sat on, and no other man would dare intervene. This was the major source of Igbo women's authority and means of protection. In 1900, the arms of British imperialism reached Igbo land. The British condensed the many Nigerian and Igbo states into the Niger Coast Protectorate, and by 1918, the Igbo people were stripped of their sovereignty. Following their invasion, the British enforced a violent suppression of indigenous institutions. The colonial government replaced the General Assemblies and Mikiri with new village representatives called warrant chiefs. Warrant chiefs were native men who executed colonial law in their own villages. This violated Igbo values, as no one man was ever designated as the sole representative of the village. Another colonial imposition was gender bias. The colonizers brought with them strict Victorian views on gender roles that failed to acknowledge the political power women had previously held in Igbo societies. Colonialism destroyed Igbo women's traditional autonomy and social power. The Western gender narrative is defined by the body, 2 bodies, 2 sexes, 2 identities. The British imposed this male and female binary and the gender roles and hierarchies that come with it. The institution of the colonial government and the authority of warrant chiefs degraded women's positions in society, and they suffered abuses they had not previously experienced. Warrant chiefs often abused their new power and ignored Igbo customs. They took women's produce and animals and forced women to marry them by ignoring the women's traditional right to refuse any offers of marriage. The introduction of the male deity in Christianity further alienated women from religious practices. Missionaries brought with them Western education and Christian views of marriage that confined women and girls to the home. Women were to be wives and mothers, meek, obedient, and submissive. Pre-colonially, Igbo women could have titles, which gave them honor, wealth, respect, and authority. The Christian missionaries were determined to prevent women from taking these titles because they saw the rituals that were associated with title taking as pagan. The British colonized the way people experienced gender, and in doing so, removed women from the most important roles in Igbo society. Igbo women faced a society in which they had very little representation in comparison to the vital role they played before colonization. By 1929, Igbo women became aggressive toward their colonizers. The women in southern Igbo land heard they were going to be taxed by the British colonial government, and this fear compounded until the women rebelled. This led to what the Igbo people call the Women's War and what the Westerners commonly refer to as the Aba riots. On November 23rd, 1929, a warrant chief confronted a woman and told her to count her animals so that she could be taxed. The woman retorted, "Was your mother counted?" And they began to fight. Word spread quickly, and women all over the province amassed in protest of the taxation. The Igbo women fought back in the way that their tradition long dictated and respected, by sitting on the colonial government. Thousands of women sat on their warrant chiefs, replicating their tradition of destroying offenders' huts by burning court buildings. In response, colonial troops shot and killed more than 50 women and left an additional 50 wounded, though the women never seriously injured the British men. The British viewed the Women's War as little more than irrational and referred to it as riots. They failed to see that the Igbo women were acting within their rights, a practice their traditional structures allowed for. In the aftermath of the Women's War, the colonial government held a commission of inquiry to determine what needed to be done about the Igbo women. At the commission, one woman who participated in the sitting on of the colonial government stated the motivation behind the riots. "We thought the chiefs were oppressing the people and wanted to lose the whole country, spoil the land. It was also that women were to pay tax, and that is why we rose. We rose to say that women should not be taxed and men should not be taxed either." The Igbo women stated their demands. They did not want to be taxed by the colonial government. They desired that, quote, all white men go back to their own country. And barring both of those things, women should be able to serve as district officers or warrant chiefs to achieve some representation in the government. Ultimately, their demands were ignored. Traditionally, Westerners believe that their influence has emancipated African women. However, under British rule, Igbo women lost their rights to participate in government and the economy in their traditional ways. The rebellion of the Igbo women against the inequality within their traditional structures of power was within their traditional structures of power and is a testament to the strength of marginalized women, both past and present. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Sydney. That was a really, really fantastic presentation. Dr. Sako, have you got any comments you'd like to add? Any questions for the panelists? We're actually finished a little bit early, so we've got a good amount of time for taking questions, either from yourself and I've got some questions coming in as well.
So how much time should I take? 10, 15 minutes?
Sounds good. I think so.
Yes, so thank you all very much. I missed like first 1.5 presentations, sorry for that. But I think overall the panel is excellent, and there are some papers which have like similarities. For example, Mira's paper and Nade's paper, the first and third presentations, and I mean, both they are dealing with kind of literature, which is a comparatively, we can say, newer source in historical writing. But then again, we see the differences, between different kinds of primary literary sources. I mean, one is, kind of solid historical non-fiction literary sources. Then Nade is dealing with like fiction and how we can kind of connect fiction with reality, the value of fiction in history writing. So we see, some connections and some differences both in themes and in, sources also. And for example, the last presentation on Igbo women, I mean, which is very striking because it's completely different from South Asia perspective, because I am like mostly familiar with South Asian perspective. So it's like completely different. So maybe now I can ask some questions, where, sorry, I'm looking for the, yes, so maybe I missed the first presentation, but I would start with Mira's paper. Do you see any connection between, let's say, mainstream nationalist movement and women's movement, like gender movement for women's rights in this period? Or you see it as a separate, sovereign domain away from the nationalist movement. So should I ask all the questions and then go for answers, or should we do it one by one?
I think let's do it one by one. We have got some, we've got a few questions trickling in on the function as well. So I think we might want to answer those. But yeah, I think one by one sounds good.
Yeah, so my first question would be, do you see it as part of the nationalist movement or a completely different sovereign domain of gender movements, women's rights movements?
I think in the context of the sort of mid to late 19th century, the women's movement in India, and particularly the sort of movement that we see in the 20s with Gandhi, hadn't really started to develop. At least it hadn't in Gujarat, which is where I was focusing on. And I think that I wouldn't say that they're necessarily separate domains either. I think that many of the changes that we see in this period with women being encouraged to enter the public sphere, that they kind of started, they influenced how women left their homes, how women behaved in the public sphere. And that's what then played into the nationalist movement sort of 20 to 30 years later. So I don't think we see that form of women's nationalism or a right for women, a move towards women's rights, but we definitely see the kind of precursors to that during this period.
So I'll just very briefly ask a follow-up question. Don't we see a different kind of nationalist politics in pre-Gandhian era? For example, if we look at Bal Gangadhar Tilak and kind of early right-wing Hindu nationalists, they are actually trying to preserve the traditional patriarchy from the influence of Western. They use this word, Western culture, quote unquote Western culture. And we also see this, the outbreak of plague and the colonial state, establishing government state hospitals, and they were trying to have women in hospitals. But the nationalists, they don't want women to go outside their homes without veils and show their faces to other people. And then the colonial state is forcibly entering native houses, indigenous houses, to shift plague patients to hospital. And that leads to a huge riot, and some of the colonial doctors and medical administrators were also murdered. So maybe it's a different kind. The connection with nationalist politics, women's issues and nationalist politics, these two had a separate kind of relationship in the pre-Gandhian era. But don't you see that it was still, do you think that it was still a very potent issue in early nationalist movement?
Again, speaking specifically for the context of this magazine, so a sort of urban elite Gujarat context, I think there was more of a hybrid sort of hybrid identity, and there were various registers of elite status operating. So you had the British, you also had upper caste Brahmin sort of status, you had Muslim and Islamic status of elite power, and you also had this group of Parsis, which were actually quite against many of the things that you had said, and they were the almost very first community in India, and a kind of indigenous community that got rid of Parda, that encouraged the women to step outside of their house. So speaking for the context of this magazine, this kind of Hindu right nationalism doesn't really impact the magazine and the magazine's operation, but you can still see elements of that register operate this. There are examples of that register still within the magazine, in some cases where there's a reinforcement of traditional spheres of where women should be, what women should do. So that it definitely exists in the broader context, but perhaps not so much for the magazine itself.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think if we have other questions on your paper, then we can have those questions now.
Yep, absolutely. So there's a question here for Ned, actually. You mentioned that previously authors have failed to depict female trauma during the partition. Why do you think that is? Is it just that women's voices were lost at the time due to their position in society, or is it something else?
Yeah, well, I think I'd say maybe there's three things really. So, like, obviously, primarily the first thing that comes to mind is that Sidwa is a female author, and the other novelists I mentioned are male authors. So maybe there's a connection there. I'd also suggest that like Sidwa has quite a lot of like lived personal experience with working with women who had experienced violence in the 1980s. So she like worked in a destitute women's camp in Lahore, and she lived opposite a recovered women's home, which she describes in the novel. So maybe there's an element of that lived experience there. And then, yeah, I don't know. I guess the final point really would be that I think there's this kind of difficulty of using language to portray traumas, and I think that Sidwa is quite a lot writing in the 1980s, whereas people like Bisham Shani or Khushwant Singh are writing in the 50s, in the 70s, and so maybe there's this element of time provides a space in which she is able to engage with these traumas in a way that novelists who are kind of immediately afterwards can't. I don't know if that answers the question.
Thank you. And we're getting a few more questions in. This one is for anyone really on the panel who wants to take this one. What inspired you to talk about your respective topics? How do you think that gender bias in historical events can be improved? So I guess either from Sydney or Emma, if you'd like to answer that question.
Sure. I think that it's hard to get rid of gender bias in historical events. I don't think that that is necessarily possible, because as historians, even we bring our own gender bias to reading history. So I think that that's an ongoing challenge and will continue to be. As far as what inspired me to talk about my topic, I was doing research initially for a course project. This was a part of a paper that I wrote for a course, and we were writing about how gender is affected throughout history. And I think that what initially inspired me when doing research for this was just that there wasn't a lot of research that was accessible on the topic, and that piqued my interest. And so that is something that a difficulty that I came across in my research, just that it was very colonized research, finding the narratives in the research, accessing that from about Igbo women pre-colonization was more difficult, and that kind of was a challenge and inspired me to keep digging. So I think that is what mostly inspired me to research this topic.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, it's interesting. It's, as historians, like you say, we're all going to have some sort of bias, and I think the best that we can do, which is what this whole conference is about, is decolonizing those historical narratives and thinking from as objective perspective as we possibly can, to make sure that we're doing these histories justice. So thank you. There's a question
here.
Pardon?
Can I ask a question on this paper, on this issue? Hello?
Go for it.
Yeah. So I was thinking, can we problematize decolonization a bit? Because my impression from your paper is that it's a bit one way and kind of black and white picture, because I think sometimes it's very important to have the colonizer's perspective also. And there is also this debate, who can write history and what is lived experience in history. So some people, they like to argue that only people who have lived experience from one side, one perspective, should write history from that perspective. But personally, I mean, even in my personal life, I find, and particularly again, I will come back to the context, specific context of South Asia, that often leads to marginalization of, non-nationalist, marginalized section of indigenous societies. For example, in the Indian context, the history of women and also the history of, quote unquote, low caste people, the Dalit people now, because traditionally, I mean, they were deprived, so they did not have the resources, to write history, and also their history were like, I mean, in nationalist history, after independence, after decolonization, their histories were completely suppressed, vanished by nationalist history, and it became a grand story, colonialism versus anti-colonial movement. But whenever you try to do that, whenever you try to bring that perspective now, immediately you are branded as a stooge of the British, as a lackey of the British. I'm like, personally speaking, I'm the biggest victim. Every now and then I get like death threats and rape threats. People are emailing to the university, sack Abhijit Sarkar. Then it goes for 7-8 days, then it dies down. Then after 7 or 8 months, if I publish something new, then again it starts and continues for 2 weeks. But that's not happening from, the British side or colonizer side. That's happening from the colonized side. Because among the colonized, I mean, earlier we used to think there is only one monolithic colonized mass, but even within the colonized mass, there are various factions, various groups, and some of these groups, they formed very unique relationship with British colonial state. They bargained, they managed to carve out, some space for their social upliftment. So they were more concerned with their social everyday upliftment. For example, the Dalits, who were untouchables. I mean, if you can't touch them, they are polluted. So they are more concerned about their everyday life, respect, status, equal rights in everyday life. They are not thinking about, macro level economic structures. So I would like to ask you, what do you think that this decolonizing history project should be more nuanced and questioned? And I mean, another unrelated question, what kind of sources you are looking at? Because I read your paper and it's mostly secondary sources. And so I'm very curious that what kind of primary sources these authors are also using, the authors of these books and articles.
Yeah, I think that is an interesting perspective. It can often be polarizing, like you said, between colonizer and colonized. And I think that there definitely is space for more nuance that is needed. For instance, like you could see in Igbo communities, the warrant chiefs were a good example of that, I think, because they took positions in the colonial government as Igbo men, and they saw the benefits from participating in the colonial government. But I think, yeah, my paper is mostly based on secondary sources, because like I said, it was difficult, at least where I'm at physically, to have access to primary sources. So most of my primary source research came from the secondary sources. I would have to go back and look at my bibliography to see where the primary sources from my secondary sources came from. But I did share a bit about the ABBA Commission, the ABBA Riot Commission, which was the published court proceedings of the women and witnesses from the Women's War and who participated. That was the bulk of my primary source research came from, because it was direct testimony from women that participated in the Women's War and also from witnesses at the time.
just to add like one line, this is actually a methodological problem with bringing women to the center, because often most marginalized women, they don't leave any kind of source trace or literary trace. I mean, many of them are illiterate, so we don't find autobiographies or something. So that's why I asked the question, that there is always this, problem issues with finding sources, primary sources.
We are coming up to past, so if you are all happy, we can probably take 3 more questions, 2 or 3 more questions. But there is a question here for Emma, actually. How can looking at female accounts of historical events, such as the conflicts in the Philippines, show us as historians a different interpretation of them?
I mean, I don't really know if I would go as far as to say different, although I do think you sort of get a more complex vision of stuff, especially if you're talking about guerrilla interference, which was most of the time not that well registered by official sources, by like government sources. Specifically talking about the Second World War and guerrillas, both pro-American and the Huks, who were communist. Those movements went largely unrecognized up until the end of the 20th century or the 21st century. So this, the inclusion of women, I think, is quite important, especially if we're talking the Second World War, because they were painted both in, like, if we're talking about using fiction as sources, in many cases they were described as unilaterally as victims, which they were, and there was certainly a lot of violence against women and instances like that. But I think the inclusion of women not just as passive subjects but as active subjects, it gives a more enriched, I think, idea of what happened. And I think if we want to understand something as complicated as the Second World War, or even just like guerrilla movements in the Second World War, I think it is crucial to sort of include the less recognized participants, I guess.
Thank you for that answer. One more question from the Q&A section. This is for Mira. Educated Gujarati women who have migrated from Gujarat today are still influenced by these traditional customs and rules. Why do you think this still prevails within in society?
So I think it takes quite a lot of time, like it's to actually remove these kinds of ideas, particularly when they're ingrained both through the educational setting, so like formally outside of the home, but also informally through family and sort of kin and community networks. And I think as a result of those, as a result of both factors, it's possible that some of these ideas have still ingrained, although I would say that they've probably taken on slightly newer forms and differing forms. What I didn't have much time to like go on explain in my paper was in this time we see a sort of hybrid identity formulate. So it's not just a colonial Victorian identity. It is a combination of like indigenous views of women or views on the position of women merging with Victorian ideals, neither of which were like particularly great for the position of women, but nonetheless it kind of created a hybrid identity. And I think that's what we still see today, that there are legacies of that hybrid identity in some Gujarati women.
Thank you so much for that question. Yeah, from a Gujarati family myself, it's definitely something that I've managed to identify as well. So thank you for everybody sending their questions. And Dr. Sarko, have you got any other questions you'd like to ask the panelists? I think we've got time for one more.
Then yeah, Why not? Then I will ask one question to Nate. I mean, if we think of Sidwa's, lived experience, but still that's kind of a participant's observation, right? I mean, she herself was not the victim, but she saw it. So her lived experience is a particular type of lived experience. I think it's still not the victim's perspective. So do you have any idea, I mean, methodologically, how we can, kind of counter this or come up with a more rounded view of women's experience, like women who actually suffered, who were maybe, forced to migrate from one place to another?
Can you hear me? Yeah, well, so in the, that I sort of just brushed over that really, but in the novel, there's a really interesting part of the novel where she writes she sort of digresses from the narrative, and she writes a story of a kind of like a raid on a village, and it's based off a sort of semi-oral interview she did with a victim like 20-30 years after the event, and so it's quite interesting because in the passage she flips the narrative perspective, flips from both his perspective and also to like Sidwa's narrative perspective, which kind of intrudes, which I think is quite an interesting sort of like merging of those two disciplines, of the fictive discipline and the oral, the two types of testimony that are at work there, the fictive and the oral, which I think gives you that sort of recognition that she is outside of it, i.e. because she hasn't actually lived the experience, but then she's similarly inside of it through the oral testimony that she's collected. But then I also think a footnote to that would be that there is perhaps simply this kind of irredeemable nature of those experiences, in that obviously because Sidwa didn't personally experience it, there has to be a recognition of some kind of limitation to that.
Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you. So this panel has come to a close now. Unless Dr. Sarkar, you've got anything else you'd like to add? Any thoughts, final thoughts?
No, not really. I think all the papers are very good, like from different perspectives. People have used different kinds of, sources. And that also shows, there is no kind of one particular way of bringing women or other marginalized, subjects to the center, People are pursuing various different ways.
Yeah, absolutely. This has been an incredible discussion. So thank you, everybody, for tuning in at home. But thank you obviously to our panelists, to our panel chair. Apologies for the technical difficulties. Thank you for taking the time out today. I hope you've all learned something new and interesting. I know I definitely have. So we will now be having a break. So obviously, grab some lunch, stretch your legs, whatever. The next event will be starting at 3:35, and we'll be having our keynote speaker, Dr. Melissa Honour-George. So yeah, other than that, thank you so much, everybody, for tuning in, and I hope you all stay safe and well. And thank you so much.